Hi, everyone. Welcome to Where Stories Build Bridges and Break Barriers. My name is Brady Licht, and I'm here with some awesome people today to have a conversation with them about storytelling and education and kind of share that with the wider world. So with me, I have Michael Hernandez, Dr. Scott Simpson, and Sharla Steever. So a little bit about why we're meeting today. Well, education is at a crossroads. Since ChatGPT arrived in 2022, traditional essays and tests have obviously become a little bit easier for students to overcome, or at least try to cheat around. Schools are still healing from pandemic fractures. We're still facing cultural polarization that makes conversations difficult, and students are asking more loudly than ever, when will my voice actually matter in school? And these aren't separate crises. Storytelling addresses all of them at once, ideally. And so what does AI struggle to do? Well, it can't share your lived experiences. It can't record your actual voice. It can't document your creative process. Storytelling is inherently AI resistant because it requires authentic humanity. But it does something even more important. For 100,000 years, humans have used stories to transmit knowledge, build community, and bridge differences. And Indigenous people have preserved accurate information for thousands of years through oral tradition. And that's sophisticated pedagogy that Western education is only beginning to understand. And so the three educators we're hearing from today have pioneered different but complementary approaches to storytelling. One reimagines assessment through the lens of filmmaking. Two integrate Indigenous wisdom to heal fractured communities. And all three recognize that education happens through story, not despite it. So our first panelist brings an unusual combination to education, a Master of Fine Arts in Film Production applied to more than 25 years of teaching at Miracosta. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Miracosta High School. Michael Hernandez is the 2015 to 16 Los Angeles County Teacher of the Year, National Geographic Fellow, and author of the February 2024 ISTE book, Storytelling with Purpose. And documentary filmmaker Ken Burns called it a wonderful book that anchors storytelling in the classroom. And Michael's work confronts the question that haunts every teacher in 2025 and likely beyond. How do you design assessments that students can't cheat on and don't want to cheat on? His uncheatable assessments methodology makes assignments so meaningful and engaging that cheating becomes pointless. When students create documentaries, podcasts, and advocacy videos for authentic audiences, they demonstrate deeper learning than traditional tests could ever reveal. His award-winning Mustang Morning News program has alumni working at NBC, ABC, MTV, and Disney. And what I find personally most compelling about Michael's perspective is his perspective on AI. He's cautiously optimistic that artificial intelligence can transform education by forcing us to abandon rote memorization and focus on what's uniquely human: originality, creativity, and authentic voice. And as he's noted elsewhere, it's not so much what you know, but what you can do with what you know that matters. Michael, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. That's a great summary of the book and the course and everything I've been working on. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for having you. Thanks for being here and sharing your perspective with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Our next panelists represent a different but equally powerful approach to storytelling, one rooted in Indigenous pedagogy and more than 15 years documenting elder wisdom. Dr. Scott Simpson brings a PhD in creative writing and training as a Center for Courage and Renewal facilitator, and Sharla Steever has earned the Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching and served as a U.S. Department of Education Ambassador Fellow. And together they video interviewed more than 350 Native elders from North and South Dakota, creating the Will Lakota Project and Teachings of Our Elders. And when North Dakota required all K-12 schools to teach Native history in 2021, their work became the official resource. And their most significant contribution may be the Circle Bridge framework detailed in their 2024 book, endorsed by Parker J. Palmer. Circle Bridge synthesizes Indigenous talking circle traditions with circle of trust practices to create spaces where genuine healing and understanding can happen across cultural divides. And they've implemented this across hundreds of schools, addressing the fractures that many of us are navigating right now. And what distinguishes their approach is how Indigenous wisdom isn't added to Western pedagogy, but recognized as an equally sophisticated system. The 7 Lakota virtues, talking circle protocols, and storytelling as primary knowledge transmission. And these are foundational pedagogy. As Elder Gladys Hawk of Standing Rock explains their work simply, how do you get students to remember what they learn? Well, you tell them a story. Scott and Sharla will share how Indigenous storytelling traditions build the relational trust necessary for all authentic learning. Scott, Sharla, welcome.
Thanks, Brady.
Thanks, Brady.
It's good to be with you.
Likewise. So I have a couple questions today just to kind of share with the whole group. Feel free to chime in, interrupt again. We're going to keep this very casual and just so we can kind of share some great insights on storytelling with the wider community. So my first question and this goes for everyone, but Michael, it's a little bit directed at you, of course, is what makes a story uncheatable, and how does that connect to building genuine relationships in schools?
That's a great question. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that, both with my book and the course, but which are kind of a culmination of 25, 26 years of teaching storytelling, essentially journalism, as well as fiction, film, and documentary, and other kinds of storytelling as well. And I think it's important to sort of define storytelling more broadly than just videos and documentaries. But so I also think about social media posts are a type of story, infographics, editorial illustrations, explainer videos that you might make. So there's a wide variety, data visualization for math and science, really important to tell the story of numbers and make sense of data. And I think it's uncheatable in a couple of different ways. And this is something I dive into in the book and the course, which is, if you care, if you're concerned about students cutting corners, which is maybe a different way of framing cheating as not a moral depravity, but as a way of maybe being mindful of their scarce resources of like time, attention, ability, those kinds of things. And we don't think that students are necessarily cheating because they're bad people, but there's many other factors as to why someone might cut corners. So I want to kind of lay that groundwork first, but stories are uniquely suited to this, what I like to call multimedia research projects. So we're talking about nonfiction as well as fiction stories, is that they're unique. There's one of a kind and they can't be replicated. Because they're original. There's some kind of personal connection there that the student makes to the content, whether it's how they design a story, whether it's how they speak it and deliver it, whether it's their choice of what the subject should be. There's a lot of agency involved in this. So there's a lot of personal connection. And there's a purpose behind it. So as opposed to an essay that gets thrown in the trash, or a test that goes in the trash, even a lab report for science class goes in the trash. That sends a very, very powerful message about the value of their work and their effort and what we care about our work and our content area. So instead, if the students are creating a product, in this case, knowledge and information, that they're sharing to impact other people, either to help them make better choices in their life, to motivate them to do something constructive in the world, that there's an impact and a purpose and a point behind it. As a teacher, and I'm sure maybe teachers out there can understand, you go to a meeting or you get a memo or an email, and you're like, yeah, but how does this matter to me? Why should I care about this, right? I'm just going to throw it away or just ignore it. Well, students are no different, and they want to do something impactful. They want to have a purpose. They want to be self-actualized humans, just like us. And so instead of saying, no, you can't do that, school is about pain and suffering and memorization. Instead, we can offer this as a solution and say, you know what? I care about your perspective and your unique take on the world and your experience. How can you apply that to this subject matter that we're covering? And you're still going to understand the subject. You're still going to hit all the standards, but there's a purpose beyond the classroom. So anyway, that's my take on it and what I've been focusing on for the last couple of years. Yeah.
That's great to hear. Scott, Sharla, anything else to kind of add? What do you feel makes a story uncheatable?
I agree with all of what Michael just shared. I think a big piece of it too is understanding that when I share my story, I'm sharing a part of myself. I think that when we're able to bring our full self to our learning, it connects into our brain in a way that learning about facts or learning about something doesn't. When I make it part of my own story and it becomes part of my story as I work with it, I'm going to remember it in ways that I wouldn't otherwise. And so I'm right there with you with the importance of story, bringing that learning full circle.
A lot of the work that we do is we focus on both inner work, which might be in some ways me developing my story, becoming aware of my own story, developing the courage to be able to share my story in a powerful way. But the other piece of it is the inner work. The listeners, the people who are taking in, who are receiving the story, whether that's another student or whether that's a teacher, or whether that's even, the public at large who is listening to the story of education. What does that mean? What does it mean when our students are learning? What does it mean when teachers are teaching? Helping everyone to work on becoming aware of things that can skew stories, like a bias or like my own trauma. quite often I'm just not able to hear someone else's story because all I can hear is the trauma that their story is triggering in me. So there's a lot to work on, but I think it's important that we understand we swim in story. It's one of the things that, is just beautiful is that the story is where the meaning is. Something is not meaningful. And I think Michael pointed this out. It's not meaningful unless I can figure out what's the story, what's the arc of that thing. Well, we swim in that all the time, and it's something we've got to work on, both the telling of stories and the receiving of stories.
Dr. Simpson, you mentioned creating conditions where students maybe feel safe to kind of look past that kind of trauma response a little bit. That leads into our next question. I'll just open this up to the entire group. How do you create conditions where students feel safe to share their authentic voices?
I can start that one off. I really feel like the first step is teacher vulnerability. I, as the teacher or the adult in the room, need to be in a space where I feel like I can share mine a little bit. As I begin to share my own story and examples of my own learning and my own experiences, I think that connects to students in ways that they don't have connections to their teachers otherwise. One of the things I think it does, it creates a level of vulnerability. It also allows a student to know their teacher beyond the content that they teach. And so they're getting a little insight into who their teacher is. And as they begin to see their teacher and their co-learners, the students that are in the class with them, as the human beings that they are, it begins to create a space where maybe I can share mine too. Maybe that is welcome here. And I think sometimes inadvertently, we send the message that school is for certain things and not other things. So these stories or whatever that we might want to share, that's not really what school is about. School is about this objective I have written out on the board today that we're going to do, and we're not going to stray from that. Where I think we can accomplish those objectives beautifully using stories.
I think in the classroom, our students are, as Sharla points out, there's certainly the value of sharing the personal story, getting to know the person that I'm in this classroom with, and building that trust because I know my teacher's a human being. But there's also the story of the classroom and of learning itself. And sometimes we tell a story about what learning is. Michael referred to this some, that learning, like the story that many students learning is hard. It's nose to the grindstone. You're not going to like it. It's taking the place of something else you'd rather be doing. And all of these are stories that we teach, that we tell inadvertently by the way we do things in the classroom. I know my own trauma in middle school felt like my identity really didn't matter. I felt like because of the way we were doing things, and I know that the techniques that were being used were data driven. I know that they had been researched. I know that the numbers said this should help students to learn. But what it felt like to me, and we've actually used this metaphor in some trainings. You remember those Play-Doh fun factories? You put the Play-Doh in, and then you push the thing down, and if you've got it set on the star, it'll squirt out stars, or the spaghetti, or the snake. That's what middle school felt like to me. I'm getting shoved into a Play-Doh fun factory, and it really doesn't matter what shape I am, or what my goal would be, or what my story is. The story of school is we have a plan. You're all going into this, and we're going to put enough pressure on you that you come out the other end in the shape that we want you to be in. And I don't think any of my teachers intentionally wanted to do that. But it's quite often what we do to our students is what's been done to us. What we do as human beings quite often is what's been done to us. So becoming aware of that and saying, is this really what a human being does to another human being, no matter the setting? And once our students realize this is a human being who actually sees me and wants to help me grow, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, 100% on everything you guys are both saying, this idea of standardized, like everyone's the same. And also the flip side of this, which is the assessment, because the assessment drives everything. And so if you're
Yep.
data driven, you're just looking for numbers rather than something else that might be more important in life, like courage and originality, being a good person. How do you measure that, right? And so we teach to the assessment and we're required, and it's not always the teacher's fault. They're oftentimes required by their school district or the state to teach to the test, and otherwise their job is on the line, right? So, and yeah, and I think this idea of safety is a big one, and there's different kinds of safety. I think a lot of people default to physical safety, but I think it's much more deeper and political than that. Like right now in our country, it's not safe to, some teachers can't even use the word racism in their classrooms and
Yep.
teach that, say the word bias. And so when we ban these words, it becomes unsafe to even discuss a topic. And so there's different kinds of safety that we're talking about. There's, I teach a lot of creative arts, photography, film, graphic design. So the freedom to be creative, safety in making mistakes, but there's also intellectual safety as well. Can we ask important questions? Can we ask questions that make people uncomfortable? Right? And right now in our country, that's a hard thing to do at every level. But that's necessary and critical for any kind of real learning and any kind of being a good citizen. You have to ask difficult questions, and everyone's got to be okay with that. And so this is why storytelling is so vital for teaching these skills, because not only are you teaching skills of listening to other people's stories. In fact, I say that listening is the most important skill in storytelling. Now, when we talk about student voice in school, it's not about voice, it's about listening. Like, can you synthesize and truly understand what someone else is saying or what the data is showing, and synthesize that and then process that back? And so having the courage to ask those really important questions, I think, is important. The other thing I think that's really helpful in how storytelling helps us teach these, they call them soft skills, but they're really core skills of being able to give and receive constructive feedback, and honoring uniqueness and individuality, which this traditional school system doesn't do, and American society has trouble with in general on many levels. Maybe not in music, but maybe, I don't know, what's the algorithm telling you to listen to? But the idea behind the story is that, unlike most traditional assessments and assignments that only the teacher sees and nobody else, no other kid in the class knows what anybody else did. They don't know what it looks like, sounds like. They don't know what the idea is. So it's all like spy school. You're making your assignments for your eyes only. And instead, with a story, because it's meant to be experienced publicly by other people, it's out in the open. And so the part of the assessment is a gallery walk. We project the images or play the videos on screen in front of the entire class, and everybody gets to give feedback. And that's scary at first. You have to get used to that, like the vulnerability of doing that. But in your traditions and in your grading criteria, like you're saying, Scott, it's the criteria and the systems that either cause kids to be safe or unsafe. Can we encourage and find uniqueness and surprises and honor that? And what's cool about that is that then the kids learn to develop those skills of giving and receiving constructive feedback. What counts for constructive feedback? How might I use this feedback, if at all? What are my criteria for that? I know that they're not here to hurt me. They're here to help me become better. And that's something that school also is set up. You're on your own island, sink or swim by yourself in a vacuum. And instead, we're a community of learners, right? And so we can help each other, either because we're on the same team working on a collaborative project, or just because we care about what that person's doing and it's cool. And then when the student sees somebody else's work, they're inspired and go, wow, never thought about that before. And then we can, as an educator, I can say and highlight and encourage those wild ideas, the most original things. And then after a while, that starts to become the culture of Hernandez is looking for the most unusual, outlandish kind of thing. And it sort of gives them the space and the freedom because I'm grading it. And that's a grading criteria, originality. Right? How unique is this? Not just a repetition of what you think I want you to say or do, or what your friends think they want you to do. And that's hard because we have to overcome a lot of cultural inertia, what they're hearing at home, what they're hearing on, the algorithm. But I think just by the nature of doing and feeling that experience of making and publishing a story, it builds so many really important skills to be a good citizen. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They sort of relegate the arts as that little nice, fun, nice to have thing on the side once we have, done the real learning of like test taking and essay writing. Not that, essay writing is not important, it's vital, but, can we incorporate this all together? So anyway, that's my take on the safety piece.
I love that. If I could say one thing of what Michael reminds me of is that one of the important things about storytelling is it reminds us that learning itself is social, it's relational, and so is assessment, and so is really everything else. And when we strip that out, when we make it a closed box of a person generating something that will be then turned into a number to be assessed, and there's no listener, there's no story. And to be honest, I think in many cases there's no learning, because I think human to human is where all of learning resides. Whether you're talking about the arts or math or science, it's about our interaction with each other and with the world around us. That's inherently a story.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'm hearing is it's not just telling stories, it's about creating those storytelling communities where it's not in the act of creating, which often we associate with assessments, but it's this broader concept.
Yeah.
I kind of want to turn a little bit more to kind of what some will call cultural responsiveness and just kind of take a little bit of a lens on that. So I want to kind of pull in both of your unique work. Michael, I kind of want to hear, how does your assessment approach and honor diverse student backgrounds? And Scott and Sharla, I want to hear, how does Circle Bridge help educators navigate cultural differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that's important and difficult for a lot of educators to wrap their heads around, and administrators who are assessing the teachers, is story projects from fiction to nonfiction. Like my students do hardcore award-winning journalism, right? That's the ultimate nonfiction story project. It's like STEM for the humanities. And this idea of not having one right answer, I think, is really hard for people to wrap their heads around. So that encourages the originality. It ties into the safety piece we were just talking about, but people's individual backgrounds, because they are free to explore an aspect. You give them a little bit of flexibility and agency over what aspect they're going to do and why they're doing it and for which audience are they producing this for. And so, we talk in the journalism class about what I call the nebula of truth, right? Which is the idea I came up with, which is we can't know absolute truth, but the more dots and data points we get, we can start to triangulate where the truth might actually lie. And, we talk about our own personal experiences and how that limits our experience and our knowledge, not because we're bad people or that we're not intelligent, but just that's our experience. And so if we find people of other backgrounds and experiences that can help us get more context, that can help us understand what reality is all about. And so that cuts back to like basic good research skills and scientific method, doing math, social studies research. This isn't just for the arts, but, and it's important to honor each student's perspective on it. So again, this isn't just about student voice, meaning I'm just going to say my perspective and that's it. It's like, no, you can't have an opinion unless you can back it up with evidence. So give me the evidence. And so this is actually a research project here. And so I just think it's a qualitative research project rather than quantitative. And can we use our microphones and our cameras like we might use a telescope or a microscope? Can we use this to collect data from different points of view, different experts? We talk about that a lot. What is an expert? Who counts? Who has a different experience from you? Should we include that or not? These are all really important ethical and academic decisions that we're making through the process. Very high level thinking, very ethically based. It's not just a fun project, but I think that honors, students' experiences, and it says to the entire class, this is why diversity matters. This is why listening to different people's experiences matters, because it will ultimately come back to help you Not to offend you or say that what you're doing is wrong. It's just there are multiple right answers to some very complex questions. Yes, there are some definite answers like the earth is round and climate change is man-made. That's definite. But I mean, within that, so we might say, what are the solutions to climate change? How do we solve that? There's many right answers to that, you see. So I think stories can help us build that and honor that unique individuality.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would add on to some of what you shared, Michael, and say, one of the things that we really encourage teachers to do as they're starting out this way of being in their classroom is to think about culture. When we think about culturally responsive practices, to think about culture in the broadest sense of the term, all of those things that create differences, and to really focus on developing my awareness of the differences present within the classroom where I'm teaching, that I become aware of families, that I become aware of political stances and religious beliefs and gender issues and all of, socioeconomic status, all of the things that, along with things like race and culture, affect and impact our perspectives and our ability to learn and how we take in information. And so one of the things that we work really hard with teachers on is this idea of how do we go about becoming aware of those differences and how do those differences play out in our little community that we're building here? Because as we get to know one another and we know where some of those differences are, we can also maybe predict where some of the conflicts might be and and so those are really important to create that space and to be responsive to the differences that we're seeing within our classrooms. I don't know, Scott, do you want to add anything to that about how we go about doing that? Or
yeah, I think one of the misunderstandings, one of the things that's there in every teacher's mind is that there's this monolithic idea of whether you want to call it curriculum or standards or whatever, that there's this outside thing, and this is what we're learning. And it's never that simple. It certainly is a place where, the state that we teach in has said this is the stuff that's important. But we do a thing, and this comes out of the work of Parker Palmer and the Center for Courage and Renewal, called a circle of trust, in which we have a third thing in the center. And it's what gets the learning started. It might be a piece of writing, it might be a piece of art, it might be a film, a video, it could be a poem, whatever. But we experience it together in the circle. And certainly we're learning about this third thing, because one of the things that we do is we all do a lot of work individually on that, and then we engage in some deep sharing, deep storytelling, deep listening, receiving of those stories. And as I listen to myself in my own journaling, my own connections with this third thing that we've shared, and then I suddenly listen to this other person in the circle, and then this other person in the circle, I'm getting those multiple perspectives. Not only am I learning about the third thing, I'm learning about this person over here and this person over here. I'm also learning that knowledge, growing in a depth of knowledge, comes from those multiple perspectives. And I'm also learning that it's important for me to listen to the story of someone who's very different from me, because they have seen this third thing in a really different way, a way that I would not have thought of. And I couldn't have thought of it before because I didn't have their experience. But now that I've heard their story, I've had that experience, at least secondhand. Now a whole new realm of understanding this third thing, but also the rest of the world, has been opened to me because I heard a story from someone who's very different from me.
Both of you, Michael and Scott, just reminded me, and Brady, in your introduction, you mentioned Gladys Hawk. And so this made me think of, as an elder, this made me think of a really quick story that happened in a classroom. Scott and I were doing a little bit of modeling of a lesson for a teacher in middle school. And we were talking about resources, Earth's resources, renewable, non-renewable, and that kind of thing. And one of the lessons that we did, we invited in the voice of, as you were talking, Michael, about who who are the experts? What makes them an expert? How do we know we can trust them? We brought in the voice of a NASA scientist as they were talking about resources in the earth and where these are found, and when they're non-renewable, that once they're gone, and things like that. And then we had Gladys Hawk, who we had interviewed, had her video where she spoke and talked about looking out her window and seeing all of these train cars filled with coal going by their town day after day after day. And her bit of wisdom that she asked the learner was, I wonder what they're putting back. We know that we need to keep a balance. So as we're removing these resources, how are we giving back to, she would use the term Unchimaka, which is Lakota for Mother Earth. And so both of what you've shared made me think about that when we bring in both of those perspectives, those students, we're hearing from an elder from their own community who was wise, and a scientist who was bringing in the research and the data, and putting those two things together made such a beautiful combination for their learning.
Thank you all. I know one thing at the heart of kind of what we've talked about is, this idea of relational trust and kind of making sure that students feel comfortable kind of sharing their stories. And so I want to ask you all, in your experience, what does relational trust actually look like in practice? And particularly, how do you know when you've achieved it?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, it's really hard in the classroom because you have already this power dynamic of the person who gives the grades. And a lot of times students want to please that person because they're the one who's in control of your fate. We were talking about relationships before too, and this idea of, admitting when you're wrong or telling your story. And so luckily, I try to, at least in my classroom, I know a lot of teachers do this, is, be a learning partner. And so when we try something new, a new assignment or project that's never been done before, there's been several times when, I challenge my students with something and like, can we see an example? I'm like, no, you're the first ones to do this. Like we did a project with AI 2 years ago when it first came out, make a movie with just AI, including creating the images. Like, is there an example? Nope. No one's done it before. And to admit that my vulnerability as a teacher, as a learner, to say, I don't know everything. I know you guys are good at this technology thing. You're good at this sport. Like, help me understand. And I think not to let the students do whatever they want. And yes, I'm still the adult in the room, and to make sure that relationship is still maintained, professional distance and all of that. But to say to the students, like, let's learn together and let's figure this out together, I think not only says that I am still a continuing learner and that learning never ends, really important, that there's more to learn, and then I trust them. I trust them to share their ideas, perspective wise and informationally. So I think that's maybe a start. I don't know how I measure that. That's a difficult thing to measure. Maybe you guys have a better solution for that, but I see it when the students start to offer answers eagerly. I don't have to call on kids. They offer it up. Or when I give a student a challenge, they just do it instead of, going, I don't know, or what do you want to see, or something like that. So it's maybe more nonverbal and relational than quantitative. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think on the trust part, vulnerability is the word that comes to mind. And as Michael points out, the teacher first and foremost sets the tone in that room. If I'm able to be vulnerable with my students, if I'm able to say, I'm a learner right alongside you, I learned something from you today. I don't know that answer. Or as I had trouble with, I was an English teacher who had trouble with spelling. And so when I started out, I was so nervous about writing on the board. And so finally I got to a place where I could say, hey, okay, guys, I'm going to write up here on the board. You guys are my spell checker because this board doesn't have a spell checker. So please let me know. And it just relaxed everything. So that capacity for vulnerability is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. The one measurable thing, and it's not quantifiable, But I think the authenticity, it goes back to story, the authenticity of the stories we're able to tell. I wouldn't go so far as to call it propaganda, but quite often the stories that students are telling and the stories that teachers are telling are not authentic stories. They're the story I want you to think, the story that makes me feel safe, or the story that makes you think I'm like that or whatever.
Mhm.
And you can you can hear those stories, you can see those stories, and that's a measure of how much trust has been developed in the classroom. Now, that's not to say that anyone should ever be forced to come clean with their authentic story. That's got to happen naturally. But when that does happen, when someone opens their mouth one day and tells a story or says something that is just real, you know that you've clicked another notch on that level of trust in that classroom. And you really, at least with that group, it's hard to go backwards on that. Once you've developed that, we were talking with a teacher just the other day at a training. She said that she had developed using the circle, had been doing this with her students, and the other teachers were coming to her and saying, how is it that you're getting them to do that? And then the kids would say, when we're just talking, that's fair game. But when we get in the circle and we say things, that's holy. That's absolute. That doesn't go anywhere outside of this. And at least when they come together and do that circle, there's a lot of trust there.
Mhm.
As a elementary teacher, that's my background. One of the things that I would always look for in my classroom that showed me that we were in that sweet spot for learning was when the hum would happen. And what I mean by that is there's a hum that happens in your classroom when everybody is engaged and they're working and they're trying things and I feel like when you hit that beautiful sweet spot, what's happening is they've taken over their learning. They aren't doing it because Mrs. Steever asked them to do it. They're doing it because they're genuinely curious and interested and really wanting to learn. And there's that trust in place that I can say this to my classmate or I can bring this up to my teacher because I know I'm safe. And it takes a while to develop that. It doesn't happen overnight. The teacher really has to do quite a bit of work at the beginning to set that stage. And I think there's no quick shortcut for that. That takes time, and it's one of those times where we go slow to go fast. If you spend that time at the beginning of the school year establishing what kind of classroom this is going to be and having some real life examples happen where somebody maybe isn't being trustworthy or someone, says something a little inappropriate and we see how that's going to be adjusted for and corrected in gentle ways, then that's where that begins to develop. And once that's in place and we know this is how it happens, it's like what Scott's example was, that teacher that we were working with who the students themselves said, this is sacred. We do not share this outside of our circle. They take it over and it becomes who they are too. And so I think that's a really important piece to all of this is it doesn't just happen. There isn't a quick thing you can do. There's not, 1, 2, 3 step that you can do and all of a sudden you have relational trust in your classroom. It happens with concerted effort and consistency. Day after day after day, I am in a place where I can provide this for my students and they can do it for each other.
I know we've touched on a number of misconceptions in storytelling and education already, and so I kind of want to just return back and give a little bit more opportunity for that. What's the biggest misconception educators and administrators have about using storytelling in education?
I think that it's a fun, fluffy thing that's nice, but it doesn't really have much to do with learning. It's nice on when you got a little extra time, fill it with a story.
Mhm.
And I think what that says is they don't realize that stories we're swimming in them all the time. And teachers are always, always telling a story. They're telling stories about what learning is. They're telling stories about how trustworthy they are or not trustworthy they are. They're telling stories about how they feel about their colleagues in the next room, in the next room. They're telling all kinds of stories, and the students are picking up those stories. And so when we become conscious of that these stories are powerful, and then we start consistently working on how do we not only tell authentic good stories, but listen to understand the authenticity of a story. Then we begin to sort through those things and help our students develop those capacities for sorting through. One example from our work, one of the most powerful things is when you hear an Indigenous elder talk about their own experience going through the boarding school and the realities of their culture, their language, their way of being, their whole identity being stripped violently from them. If you read some of the older histories about that time period and those schools and what the people were intending to do, and I don't even want to say that all of those people had bad intentions, but the story that they were telling, that we're only going to save the bodies of these people by stripping their identity away, is a hideous story. When I get to the point where I can recognize this is a story, but it's a story that's doing violence to human beings. This is a story that's an authentic expression of a trauma situation that we can learn from, not just feel bad about it, but learn from. How do we make that not happen again? Suddenly, you are an amazing consumer of stories and using them and creating new stories to help move us all forward as human beings, rather than just being fooled by whoever's agenda can be put together in the best story, the quickest and most digestible story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
You
Sharla.
go ahead. That's fine, Michael.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say there are many misperceptions about storytelling. I was interviewed in the LA Times recently for an article about artificial intelligence and how teachers are struggling to figure out what to do for assessment. And, I come back to this idea that I've said many times, which is, we've conflated pain and suffering with good learning. And learning does need to be rigorous and you do need to struggle, but it doesn't need to be painful or harmful. And I feel like because story projects are rewarding, and we find joy in them, and the receivers and experiencers of our stories can find joy in them, that they're relegated to not good learning because we've made that incorrect assumption that to learn you have to suffer, and that's all it's about. And we have a generation of educators and administrators and parents who grew up in the No Child Left Behind era after standardized testing became the driving force behind curriculum and teacher assessment. And so they know nothing other than learning should be pain and suffering. And I think that's a big misperception that's behind a lot of these problems. I mean, just think about, how hard it is if you're a high-level athlete or a musician. There's thousands of hours of your life that you're going through pain and suffering, right? Training, conditioning, weightlifting, breaking bones and spraining joints to play this sport. Why would you put yourself through that? It's because you're passionate about it and you'll do whatever it takes to do it so that you can perform at a high level. Can we replicate that and borrow that momentum from playing an instrument or playing a high level sport to the academic world and go, we're going to do something we're passionate about and we're going to do whatever it takes to get the right answer or to create this product for an end user? There's something that's measurable, that's tangible, and is rewarding and is joyful. And so I think that's the main thing. And if anybody doubts that, just try making a documentary. I challenge you to make a documentary. It's 4 times harder than writing a report on paper, for sure, hands down. If you've never done it, take my word for it. But don't take my word for it because I know you won't. Instead, I've got a ton of research, psychological research and education research that backs up all these ideas we've been talking about. So if you need data and scientific evidence, there's a mountain of that really backs up this idea of, storytelling as an effective form of learning, more effective than traditional assessment. So if you need that data to convince your board or your parents or whatever, call me up. I'm happy to share it with you.
Yeah.
Michael, I'm so glad that you brought up that word joyful or finding joy in the learning. I think sometimes when you see students that are having that kind of an experience when they're learning, it gets thrown into the area of being fluffy or touchy-feely or, this stuff that isn't real learning. Where the reality is, I think it's some of the hardest thing when you're doing those things that really are creating joy and you're experiencing something and you are connected at that level that it actually becomes a little emotional for you. You experience the emotion of joy. That's good stuff. That's rich stuff. And I think sometimes people, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but when people are like, oh, that's too light and fluffy, that's not real learning, maybe there's some fear of their own emotion going on there. Like once we're in that state of kids experiencing great joy or great frustration as they're trying to figure out how to use iMovie or whatever it is that they're doing, it's unpredictable. I don't have total control over that. And that can be challenging for administrators and educators. You don't know exactly how they're going to respond. You don't know exactly, but that's where giving them time after time to continue to try and work with it and become used to having those kinds of emotions show up in their learning. That's the real value, because that's what you carry on with you into your life beyond school.
Yeah, 100%. And I totally agree with that. And I would also add on this idea that a lot of educators feel that storytelling doesn't apply to them. I teach science, I teach math, I teach social studies, language arts, maybe they're more amenable to that because they read novels, but it applies to everyone. I mean, the story of science, that's why we're in the conditions that we're in our country right now, because people don't know what science is about and how it helps them. And also, can you take your scientific data from your research project you did in class in the lab and explain this to a regular person? I think there's a quote from Einstein who once said that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough, right? And can you synthesize those ideas into a very clear, simple message? We ask students to tell the story of their learning all the time. It just happens to be in an essay or a test or a class presentation. So what we're saying is, build on that and elevate that into a way that then becomes public and is more interesting to create and to share rather than just get thrown in the trash again. So it does apply to every single subject area and every grade level. It's not like, well, I'm going to wait till they're in middle school, or you can do that in your language arts class. No, math teachers, you need to teach storytelling. Science and civics. Journalism is civics in action. It's living the First Amendment. It's not just talking about it. Because again, this idea of having to experience and feel it and to have to clarify it for other people, storytelling is teaching. The best way to learn something is to teach, right?
Yeah.
Well, our time is getting close to the end here, so I'd like to go ahead and just kind of wrap up by allowing you all just kind of shout out, where can people learn more about your work or more about kind of the resources out there around kind of your bodies of work? So Michael, I'll go ahead and kind of start with you, and we'll go back through the same order that we start with introductions. Tell us more about where people can find your resources.
Great. Yeah, I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can just search for me there. Also, I have my website, michael-hernandez.net. I've got lots of content there about my speaking and consulting and resources, and my course, Uncheatable Assessments, and my book, Storytelling with Purpose, Digital Projects to Ignite Student Curiosity, is available wherever you buy books.
Great to hear. Scott, Sharla?
We have a website, circlebridge.org. And that has really all the links to everything. Our books, Circle Bridge, Human Shaped Learning, and Storywork, our new SEL curriculum, story-based SEL curriculum is there. And you also have the links to all of our websites there as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you all again for your time today. I really appreciate it. And it was great to talk with you all about storytelling and education.
Thanks, Brady.
Thanks so much.